Hello, my friends, Evolutionary Energy Arts family. So, guys, there's just so much going on with this. The term that comes to my mind, really, it's just whispering to me, is the spirit of Antichrist. And of course, the spirit of Christ is one of peace, love, and compassion. And not to go religious on anybody, because it's not really about that. It's just about treating each other civilly and getting along and all. And what we're seeing, and it really feels like it's being built up, and I think it is. I do think that this is being built up. This spirit of Antichrist. It basically the dividing of us and basically trying to get everybody angry at each other. You're seeing it, and part of this is, part of this we might look at from an energetic point of view. We've talked about the magnetosphere declining. We've talked about the fact that there is more cosmic radiation coming in. And then with the work that I do, there's a lot of people that are very, very emotional from these energies coming in. And I see that because we're processing energies and having to face our shadow selves in so many ways. And that's what part of these times are about. They're actually facing our shadow. And so, that means those parts of us that perhaps we keep buried and hidden, if we are not able to let these almost self-destructive energies go. And we're seeing it boil over now, in many, many different places. And if you didn't check out last night's video with, all these protests that are going on all over the place, and, in many cases turning violent, it's growing. And let's take a look. This is off the Today Show. And there's many, many, many more sources.
Protests became violent in Portland overnight, where police in riot gear worked to break up fights between a right-wing group called Patriot Prayer and leftist Antifa counter-demonstrators. Several people required medical attention. No word on arrests.
It's exactly that type of thing that we're seeing erupting. These tiny little groups, violent tiny little groups, or groups that are prone to violence. This is so reminiscent of Germany, again, in the 1930s. For those of you that are students of history, what we're seeing going on here. This polarization, and it is a polarization. As we read over here, Oregon Live, bear spray, bloody brawls at Patriot Prayer, law and order march in Portland. And, as it says here, this post has some graphic content, and it shows the brawl again. And I do also have for you guys, you can watch it through here. And this is a small YouTube channel that caught it. And so you can watch it on here, show them a little support. It looked really like just anarchists that wanted to fight, really. And I'm amazed that you don't really see much of the police coming in. And that also, caused a little bit of an uproar. There was really no kind of putting it down. It was allowed to go on. As it really was, it just was like maybe your typical soccer hooligan type of brawl you would see over in the UK, when somebody's team lost and everybody just goes wild, beating each other up, showing I was going to say extreme amounts of, unintelligence, because these type of actions, they don't ever solve anything. They just create bigger problems. And so the Portland Police Bureau reported seeing protest and counter-protest participants outfitted with hard-knuckle gloves, knives, and firearms earlier in the evening. Police said they made no arrests on Saturday night, but continued to investigate. The wild scene unfolded amid mounting tensions among both groups. fueled in part by a pair of national news stories. A march in Portland against police brutality last week drew headlines after law enforcement's hands-off approach to the event was blamed for an encounter between protesters and an elderly driver, which outraged many, including Patriot Prayer leader Joey Gibson and his supporters. And on Friday, viral videos surfaced showing members of the Proud Boys, a right-wing fraternal organization, beating 2 or 3 protesters in New York City after an event in the Republican Party headquarters. Police, however, arrested the protesters. It was against this backdrop that Gibson, who counts a number of Proud Boys amongst his ranks, organized the so-called Flash March for Law and Order in PDX, ostensibly to protest Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler and his oversight of the city's police force, waving American flags and breaking into patriotic chants. Gibson and about 36 people set off to a street memorial for Patrick Kimmons, a 27-year-old black man shot and killed by police, an incident that prompted last week's march. As they arrived at the vigil on Southwest 4th Avenue and Harvey Milk Street, they were met by a large group of counter-demonstrators chanting Black Lives Matter. The two sides exchanged taunts and threats as police stood by and warned against physical confrontation. About 20 minutes later, the violence erupted, and below is a timeline of events from the evening. And so this is Portland, which feels like it's ground zero for these type of things. You know, it's just, you know, mass violence and all. And you see all these, there's lots of videos for you guys to check out here. And, you know, what can you say? It feels like this is being built up. It feels like, you know, it feels like there are powers at work here that are really dividing everybody even more. And it's part of a bigger plan. And this article talks about the Portland mayor and his decision to stand by while Antifa basically harassed people, stopped motorists, and you know, caused a lot of mayhem. And so they also talk here about these activists chasing down a 74-year-old man after he made a right turn against their wishes, pounding on his silver Lexus and breaking a window. The car sustained thousands of dollars in damage. And so, I mean, would you feel safe going down into downtown Portland? And it's interesting, look at the commercial over here, the man in High Castle, where the Nazis won the war. You know, and then there are quite a few that say, hey, they actually did. The Nazis actually did win the war. Maybe not the Germans, but the Nazis won. And so, you know, I'm looking at the symbolism here, Washington Times, all in red. You know, you have this right here. Yeah, I mean, my God, this feels so much like we are living in Nazi Germany right now. Nazi Germany right before the rise of Hitler, or during the ascension of Hitler. There's definitely that vibe. You know, do you guys feel that vibe? I'm a big student of history. I've always been into history, you know, because we have to, and even if history is a lie, and most of it is a lie, at least, you know, becoming aware of things, you are aware of what to look for, you know, and see the manipulation that's going on. 3 arrested after violence erupts outside New York City Republican Club event. And again, you see the anarchist symbol here as well. And this is, you know, again, this is violent clashes after a speech by the founder of a far-right group. And the police say they are reviewing video and may make additional arrests. And this is what we were talking about last night too, these far right, far left, you know, extremist quote-unquote groups that are trying to, or actually that are probably being manipulated by powers and creating the violence that we are now seeing. And the reason why I'm focusing on this is because I feel like this is just starting. And it's going to get bigger as we go along. And I think that, you know, what we saw in the 60s is nothing compared to what they have planned to happen. And this is part of a bigger plan that's going on, as we've seen so many different things happen. And, we're going through tremendous earth changes, obviously. The political situation has been very tense for a long time. And we touched on that before, talking about how, President Obama was probably as hard for any, Republicans to swallow as President Trump is for the Democrats. So, there's been this polarity that's been building up and this division that's been building up. And it's also being orchestrated on many levels and played up as well. So we have to be aware of this. Vandals left a note after vandalizing the Metropolitan Republican Club, as we see the letter here. And you see the anarchist signs here on it, and it's on the doors. And it says, "Our attack is merely a beginning. We are not passive, we are not civil, and we will not apologize." And we remember the quote that Hillary was quoted as saying, "You cannot be civil with them." And, coming from somebody that has been at the very top of her party, running for the presidency, even if you later try to pull that in and rein that in, just saying you cannot be civil, that's almost like a setting your people off to war, to say that you cannot be civil with them. That's something that should never be coming out of a leader's mouth. It's just kind of shocking, really. But it does tell you about what's really going on here. And the powers that be are playing both sides of this as well. Getting the left against the right, getting the right against the left, creating this fear, and it's going to keep building. We could see that. And right here, actually, Cox said the attacks on the buildings can lead to attacks on people. And some of the same words in the statement, "We will not be civil," were used by Hillary Clinton recently. And was that a mistake, a flub? Or was it premeditated and a sign to go ahead and create anarchy? Because some will take that, in that light. They will take those words and say, "Oh, okay." Because some just have that spirit in them, that destructive spirit that wants to just tear things up. So here we call upon Mrs. Clinton, we call upon Governor Cuomo and upon Senator Schumer and Senator Gillibrand and all Democratic officials, whether elected or not, to condemn this act of violence. And, everybody on both sides should condemn it, because this could get way out of hand. And as we know, there are powers that be that want it to get way out of hand. So, moving over here, we have Netanyahu. Hamas should expect a very painful response from Israel. And, there's always a very painful response from Israel to anybody, whether it's Gaza protesters or not. As we've talked about, it's not even an eye for an eye. It's 10 eyes for a fingernail in so many cases. And after an especially violent weekend, the Prime Minister used the cabinet meeting to send a warning to Hamas. And some are surprised that he's still in there. If you follow Benjamin Fulford, he outrightly calls Netanyahu a Satanist and, totally evil. And he certainly is not a warm, fuzzy guy, at least not for most of the world, maybe to his own family. He's a big, warm, fuzzy teddy bear, but that's not really, looks more like a grizzly to the rest of the world in his actions. And so, again, this is a sign of the times and all that we see. So we have thousands lining up for zero down payment, subprime mortgages, and this is a because if you look at it, things are slowing down in the housing industry, and they were running so fast, so strong, full steam ahead, And there are signs. There are most definitely signs things are slowing. Things are starting to deteriorate in many ways economically. So even though you've had the Dow at record highs. Of course, last week, was not a good week for the Dow. There are a lot of deep signs going on that things could get kind of rough. It could be a rough road ahead. And, many have talked about Nasara and basically, a financial reset. And we could be getting ready to go there. We were just talking about in last night's video, cryptocurrencies possibly being the new currency that gets adopted. We'll see. When you get down to it, there's so little actual cash backing up the numbers. And then again, we're not on the gold standard, so it's not like there's actual gold backing up the fiat currency. And then, of course, when you look at it, it's such a small single-digit percentage that you actually have cash to handle. So, if there's ever a run, you're going to have like 93% of the population, or 93% of the money is not going to ever be handed out because it's just not there. And they could start printing, of course. It's definitely a good reason for people to take stock of what is going to be valuable going forward as we go through these times, and adjust yourself accordingly. So borrowers can have low credit scores but have to go through an education session about the program and submit all necessary documents from income statements to phone bills. They must go through counseling to understand the monthly budget and ensure they can afford the mortgage payment, and the loans are 15 or 30-year fixed with interest rates below market, about 4.5%. So yeah, that sounds great, but you know what? When we have things like this happen, usually the rug gets pulled out from under your feet shortly thereafter. And some things can trigger it, including things like this. So we have to be very, very cognizant of it. It does feel in so many ways we're staring off a cliff right now. And, again, caveat emptor. CNN poll, more see President Trump win likely as Biden leads the crowded Democratic field, and looking forward to the next big election, which, will start off in earnest in just another year. Americans are becoming more likely to think President Donald Trump will win a second term in office, while Joe Biden stands atop the crowded field of Democrats, perhaps looking to replace him. So you have Biden and Bernie, who are both, quite up there in age now. And then you have a bunch of younger ones behind that, but no real support, like Kamala Harris, or Elizabeth Warren, who Elizabeth Warren was looking like she was going to be the darling of her party, but, that hasn't materialized. And John Kerry, really? Yeah. And then you have Mayor Bloomberg and Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke, who is somebody to keep an eye on him, but we'll see. And there's nothing there, I don't think, that really excites anybody on the Democratic side too much. But one name that is not there is Hillary Clinton, and that excites just about everybody pretty much, I think, after everything we have seen. Saudis threaten to retaliate against punitive action over critic. And so President Trump has threatened severe punishment over the vanished critic that we talked about. And we talked about the fact that he went missing, Jamal Khashoggi. And according to Turkey, they have evidence that he was tortured and put to death by Saudi Arabia. And so President Trump has threatened to punish the world's largest oil exporter and also one of the largest arms importers in the world, if not the largest at this moment. They have been buying up weapons like you cannot believe, and doing it at such a fast pace. And as President Trump had said, I don't want just throw away $1 billion that they're giving us, and for the weapons, because they'll just go and spend it with the Russians and the Chinese. So this is interesting, because this could really drive a wedge here, possibly. Will it? Would they risk billions of dollars, meaning when I say they, the Trump administration, over this, over the missing Jamal Khashoggi, who hadn't been seen since he entered the Saudi Arabian consulate in Istanbul on October 2nd to pick up a document for his upcoming wedding, which, never happened. And so, could this be something that ends up splitting it? Splitting the relationship. And Trump's future be damned climate change policy. And so this is off of Yahoo over here, and it's talking about ignoring basically what's going on now. This is done from the carbon emissions and everything is humans' fault with global warming point of view. But just to see, again, what some of you, and this is becoming very, very contentious, as on the other side now we have the building grand solar minimum people. And obviously, I've never bought that everything that we're seeing is completely done, due to carbon emissions. Is man poisoning the planet? Oh, hell yeah. And, are some of the natural disasters we're seeing either karmic retribution or a direct result of what man has done? I'm sure, absolutely, without a doubt. We're not living in a symbiotic, harmonious relationship with the planet by any means. And so, yes, that is definitely the case. However, here, basically they're talking about a 7-degree increase in temperature by 2100, and basically we're all going to be flooded away from rising oceans due to all the ice melting. And as it says here, Trump, who was born in 46, can afford not to worry about sea level rise in the year 2100. If worst comes to worst, he can always find a golf course above the flood zone. So, are there issues for us to face? Of course, and that's what we've been screaming about, is the fact that we don't know exactly how much of this is man-made, and we don't know how much of it is a natural cycle. And if it is a natural cycle, does that include there being these extra solar objects, that are coming in from somewhere else, or, were they here all the time, and perhaps we just come in close proximity to, whether you call it Nibiru or Nemesis or Planet X. Is that part of what's going on as well? There's a lot of question marks that we really don't have the answers to, although we definitely have a lot of signs that these are extremely unusual times. And this is Tyler Durden from Zero Hedge, and he does come up with some really interesting articles, and this was sent in by Deborah, and so thank you, Deborah. And the article is "Trump is right, the Fed is crazy, and here's 101 reasons why it should be shut down." And so he goes on to say Donald Trump just made one of the most brilliant moves of his entire presidency by accusing the Federal Reserve of going loco. He is placing the blame for the coming stock market crash and horrific economic downturn squarely where it belongs, and he is firing up millions of true conservatives amongst his base at the same time. For many, many years, a lot of us have been trying to educate the American people about the deeply insidious Federal Reserve System. As Ron Paul once so astutely observed, it is actually about as Federal Express is. And that's the truth. And most people don't realize this. The Federal Reserve is an unelected cabal of central bankers that are running the economy into the ground, and they've done that on purpose. They've been bankrupting the country on purpose and taxing you. And the only way we are going to fix our long-term economic and financial problems is if we abolish it. So for those of us that understand these things, it's extremely exciting to hear President Trump use language such as this. So President Donald Trump knocked the Federal Reserve for continuing to raise interest rates despite some recent market turbulence. I think the Fed is making a mistake. They are so tight, I think the Fed has gone crazy, the president said after walking off Air Force One in Erie, Pennsylvania for a rally. That may be one of the greatest things that Donald Trump has ever said. And if Trump feels like his base is really responding to this sort of rhetoric, he may start using it as a campaign tactic. Can you imagine thousands upon thousands of supporters chanting "End the Fed" at Trump rallies leading up to the 2020 election? As again, we see the man in High Castle over here. On the left. Very interesting. That would be a beautiful thing. Without a doubt, the Federal Reserve has created the everything bubble, and when it bursts, the economic pain is going to be off the charts. Of course, the left is going to want to blame Trump, so Trump is being very smart by pointing the finger at the Fed for aggressively raising rates at a time when the U.S. economy is already slowing down. And you know what? CNBC's Jim Cramer actually agrees with Trump. I agree with President Trump that the Fed needs to tighten less aggressively, even as he probably shouldn't have said those nasty things in public because he's making it harder, not easier, for Jerome Powell to give him what he wants. When you look at the economy empirically right now, you start to see real problems. Following those comments, Cramer offered some examples of the real problems that he is seeing throughout our economy. Sources within the auto industry, in addition to major suppliers PPG Industries and Trinseo, have suggested to the Mad Money host that there is a definitive slowdown in auto sales. Housing is either pausing or down for the count, he said. And we just saw that article where they're going to be doing subprime again. That's not a good sign. We know this because it's what Lennar, the biggest home builder in America, told us. They have their pulse on every market. Key economic building blocks, things like packing materials and plastic, are either stagnant or dropping in price, indicating a slowdown in shipping. A leading barometer for the state of the economy, Cramer said. Needless to say, criticizing the Federal Reserve is a very dangerous thing to do. And there's a reason why previous presidents have never dared to do so. But that is one of the greatest things about Trump. He simply refuses to be controlled, well, at least from what we are seeing. And he will not be intimidated by threats. We desperately need a president that's willing to stand up to the elite and call for the abolition of the Federal Reserve. For a long time, it appeared that doing something about the Fed was not on Trump's radar, but that may be changing now. So let us hope that Trump's war with the Federal Reserve escalates significantly, because we want this to be a top national issue during the 2020 presidential election. And the following is a list of 101 reasons why the Federal Reserve should be shut down, and this is an updated version of an earlier list from one of his previous articles. And when you see what's going on here, realize too, this all falls into what I've been thinking personally all along. And when we're talking Fed, we're talking the Fed. The Federal Reserve is the banking cabal. That's who it is. It's the banking cabal that we've been talking about forever. So they are, the Rothschilds, the J.P. Morgan families, all these families that have been controlling things. There's really only a handful of them. I mean, there's 12 or 13 families, depending on who you're listening to. But they've been controlling everything through the banks. And that Act of 1871 that we had talked about previously gave them basically control of the government. And according to some, made the United States a corporation and no longer a country. And so this goes along perfectly with what we've been thinking all along, that President Trump, obviously, look at the military budget, the largest by a mile, and it's growing stronger all the time. Look at his appointees. Who has his back? It's the military-industrial complex. So is this truly a battle between the military-industrial complex and the banking cabal? Perhaps it really is. Perhaps that is really what's going on. And if we look at And for some of you, it'll be woo-woo to talk about, say, Corey Goode, the secret space program. If you ever get to check out Gaia TV and listen to Cosmic Disclosure and Corey Goode, he talks about the Alliance, and he talks about this group, and it's obvious that there are different factions going on, and there's different corporations involved. And, perhaps this is basically a civil war that's going on amongst the factions of what we would call, those that are pulling the strings. The real government behind the governments. And two factions of that government, the shadow government. And so perhaps this is really an actual war that's going on, and this is a poker game of sorts, and this feels like a poker game, especially if you're talking about the Fed, because as we were saying, the Federal Reserve is not federal. It's not federal. It doesn't have really anything to do with the government when you see it. It is those powerful banks that control everything. That is what the Fed is. And so we see this going on, and this is really interesting. This is really, really interesting, and it really does lend credence to that. And if you view everything with suspicion, whether we're talking about the likes of, say, Benjamin Fulford or Corey Goode or all these other sources that are coming through, and many times there's a lot of truth in there with a lot of propaganda. But we have to decipher and sort out that truth. And so when it comes to the Federal Reserve, look at some of these points that Tyler Durden is talking about. Number one, we like to think we have a government of the people, by the people, for the people, but the truth is that an unelected, unaccountable group of central planners have far more power over our economy than anyone else in our society does. And that's just the simple truth. Our elections and all, they don't give us the power, as we've talked about before. The Federal Reserve is actually independent of the government. In fact, the Federal Reserve has argued vehemently in federal court that it is not an agency of the federal government, and therefore not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. The Federal Reserve openly admits that the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks are organized much like private corporations. The Federal Reserve banks issue shares of stock to the member banks that own them. 100% of the shareholders of the Federal Reserve are private banks. The U.S. government owns 0 shares. The Federal Reserve is not an agency of the federal government, but it has been given the power to regulate our banks and financial institutions. This should not be happening. According to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the U.S. Congress is the one that is supposed to have the authority to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and fix the standards of weights and measures. So why is the Federal Reserve doing it? The Federal Reserve that openly admits that they are independent of the government and not subject to the government. That makes no sense at all. If you look at the US dollar, it actually says Federal Reserve Note at the top. And the financial word, a note, is an instrument of debt. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy issued Executive Order 11110, which authorized the U.S. Treasury to issue United States notes, which were created by the U.S. government directly and not by the Federal Reserve. He was assassinated shortly thereafter. Many of the debt-free United States notes issued under President Kennedy are still in circulation today. The Federal Reserve determines what level some of the most important interest rates in our system are going to be set at. In a free market system, the free market would determine those interest rates. So again, that flies right in the face. The Federal Reserve has become so powerful that it is known as the fourth branch of government. But remember, it's not part of the government. It's not subject to the government. It's not subject to the will of the people. The greatest period of economic growth in U.S. history was when there was no central bank. The Federal Reserve was designed to be a perpetual debt machine, and that is the truth. The bankers that designed it intended to trap the U.S. government in a perpetual debt spiral from which it could never possibly escape. Since the Federal Reserve was established 100 years ago, the U.S. national debt has gotten more than 5,000 times larger, completely done on purpose, so that the U.S. is the policeman of the bankers, and it is the military of the bankers, carrying out their will. A permanent federal income tax was established the exact same year that the Federal Reserve was created. This was not a coincidence. In order to pay for all the government debt that the Federal Reserve would create, and again, that's government debt, and government debt that comes from the people, to pay to the Federal Reserve, which is really the private bankers. So we are all basically contributing our time, work, effort, and money and giving it to the banking cabal. And this has created the federal income tax, and that's why it's necessary. The whole idea was to transfer wealth from our pockets to the federal government and from the federal government to the bankers. The period prior to 1913, when there was no income tax, was the greatest period of economic growth in the U.S. history. Today, the U.S. tax code is 13 miles long. From the time the Federal Reserve was created until now, the U.S. dollar has lost 98% of its value. From the time that President Nixon took us off the gold standard till now, the U.S. dollar has lost 83% of its value. During the 100 years before the Federal Reserve was created, the U.S. economy rarely had any problems with inflation. But since the Federal Reserve was established, the U.S. economy has experienced constant and never-ending inflation. In the century before the Federal Reserve was created, the average annual rate of inflation was about 0.5%. In the century since the Federal Reserve was created, the average annual rate of inflation is about 3.5%. The Federal Reserve has stripped the middle class of trillions of dollars of wealth through hidden tax of inflation. The size of M1 has nearly doubled since 2008 thanks to reckless money printing that the Federal Reserve has been doing. The Federal Reserve has been starting to behave like the Weimar Republic, and we all remember how that ended. The Federal Reserve has been consistently lying to us about the level of inflation in our economy. If the inflation rate was still calculated the same way it was back when Jimmy Carter was president, the official rate of inflation would be somewhere around 10% today. And since the Federal Reserve was created, there have been 18 distinct recessions or depressions. Within 20 years of the creation of the Federal Reserve, the U.S. economy was plunged into the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve created the conditions that caused the stock market crash of 1929, and even Ben Bernanke admits that the response by the Fed to that crisis made the Great Depression even worse than it should have been. And really, that was all done on purpose, and they do these things to pull the money into themselves. So they inflate and pull the rug out and gather up all of it to themselves, inflate again, pull the rug out, gather in more power and money into themselves. It's a cycle. It's part of what they do. The easy money policies of former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan set the stage for the great financial crisis of 2008. Without the Federal Reserve, the subprime mortgage meltdown probably never would have happened. If you can believe it, there have been 10 different economic recessions since 1950. And it goes into even more there. And according to the official government report, the Federal Reserve made $16.1 trillion in secret loans to the big banks during the last financial crisis. So they're giving themselves money, basically. And the following is a list of loan recipients that was taken directly from page 131 of the report. As you see, the dollar amounts: Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, Bank of America, Barclays, Bear Stearns, Goldman Sachs, Royal Bank of Scotland, JP Morgan Chase, Deutsche Bank, UBS, Credit Suisse, Lehman Brothers, Bank of Scotland, BNP Paribas, Wells Fargo, Dexia, Wachovia, Dresdner Bank, Societe Generale, and all other borrowers. So the Federal Reserve also paid those big banks $659.4 million in fees to help administer those secret loans. So let's give them money to help them steal from us and steal from the people. During the last financial crisis, big European banks were allowed to borrow an unlimited amount of money from the Federal Reserve at ultra-low interest rates. And the easy money policies of Federal Reserve chairs Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen have created the largest financial bubble this nation has ever seen. And this has set the stage for the great financial crisis that we are rapidly approaching. And there's more. There's a lot more. I got all the links for you guys as always. This is huge, and this is something that, the last time I mentioned this in a video, the video got stuck forever at like 600 views, and I know it was on Reddit and had thousands of views, but it got stuck at 600 views. So this is exactly the type of stuff that is they really don't want getting out there, because it really shows how things are and how they are controlled, and it gives you a true picture of what's really going on. And so this is a great article by Tyler Durden out of Zero Hedge, and definitely encourage you guys to finish reading this, and I'll have all the links for you as well. And just to touch on one thing, Stephen Hawking feared genetic engineering would create superhumans, and he had spoken out about this quite a bit. He died back in March, but he left a collection of articles which outlined his concerns about the future of the human race. In his final book, In Brief Answers to the Big Questions, out on Tuesday, Professor Hawking states that he fears wealthy people will begin to edit their own and their children's DNA to create superhumans who will be more intelligent and live longer. And perhaps that's why they need all this money. It's all their genetic research and things along those lines to basically beat death and create the new race of humans that's going to come. As we've seen, all these amazing technologies coming out. And, I just recently saw some more with the robotics that's going on. And this exosuit where, if a person got inside it, they could basically just scale up pretty much the side of a building, a skyscraper, like nothing. And the merging of humans with technology and creating these immortals or these superhumans, there's so much of this going on as well. So is this part of the big plan, and why they are doing what they're doing, to create the next race of humans? And it's just all very, very interesting to look at. And there are a lot of critics of Stephen Hawking as well, and then there are those that thought he was a genius, and we should definitely listen to him. So, my friends, as always, please do thumbs up to support the channel. Please do subscribe and join our growing family, and share with as many people as possible. Go ahead and click the bell so you get all the updates, and do your best to prepare for the times that are coming, because we have a wild ride ahead of us. From a geopolitical point of view, a financial point of view, obviously from an earth change point of view, there's a lot coming along those lines as well. There are so many ways for us to prepare and get ourselves ready, and mind, body, spirit, every single way possible. So may you guys always be blessed with abundant peace, love, happiness, and always kept safe in these times. God bless, my friends, and namaste.